think if somebody asked me what the most sensory objects are in the museum's Iran collections, it has to be these Safavid ceramic bath rasps from late 17th century or early 18th century Iran. In the museum, we refer to them as bath rasps, but they basically do the job that a pumice stone would do today. They're sensory not only because as objects they make noise themselves, but they're sensory in the ways in which they would have come into contact with the bodies of the people who used them or the bodies which they were used on. There would have been masseurs, and the people who would have used objects like this are known as the dalak, who would have scrubbed the skin of the body. The person who was being scrubbed would have had someone to assist them. And there would have been lots of activities that took place in the bath, not just bathing. People would have come to have their hair cut, possibly their hair removed, or their hair hennaed as well. Or they would have come for medical treatments, such as cupping. The oval rasp I find particularly tactile because it has these sprigs around the outside. Because the objects are glazed, I feel like actually when they're wet, they might have been slightly slippery. So I feel like having these sprigs on the outside of the object actually would have helped the user of it to hold it while it was rubbed against the skin. So this one has a crosshatch base, which does feel like it's been worn down a little bit. And as I've just turned it over, we can also hear that it has a rattle inside it. And to me, this rattle sounds like the rattle's made of quite big objects. I think they also sound like they're round. We're not entirely sure what it is that's inside it. We're hoping that we might be able to X-ray them to find out exactly what it is inside. But I'd expect it, I think, to also be ceramic. But unfortunately, we don't really have any sources that tell us about exactly what's inside. The duck also has a rattle, but it sounds quite different to the oval. I think while the rattle inside the oval was sort of bigger objects that were possibly round, the rattle inside this bird feels a bit smaller with its high pitch. And you can see that it also has marks on the base to give that rasp effect. But here again, it's different. We're not seeing a crosshatch like we did on the oval. We're seeing a sort of stippling effect. I'm not exactly sure why they rattle. There aren't really any sources that discuss that either, but we can imagine that as they were being used in the bath, they would have contributed to the other many sounds in the bath. For me, the shoe is particularly interesting as it's both a model of an object, which of course would have been worn on the foot, but in this context, for use in the bath, it also would have been used to massage the foot. So it's actually quite a playful object in many ways. We don't know exactly how it would have been used, but even just holding it in my own hands, I can feel that it might have been used like this, as that's the easiest way to hold it in the hands. But it also has a small hole in the heel, which suggests that it might have been hung when not in use. It doesn't actually have any marks on its sole. Very smooth the shoe feels much smoother. So it's perhaps more likely that this would have been used for massaging rather than necessarily scrubbing. Now we'll just think a bit about how they feel. With this large teardrop, which in many ways feels like the largest of the objects, but it still fits in the palm of my hand quite nicely. And it has that deep cross-hatching in its base, but it doesn't have a rattle. This one has a hole in the base, and I'm not entirely sure why the hole would have been created, but it means that if it did have a rattle, that perhaps all the bits have fallen out. It's difficult to tell, but I think the object is hollow, so it's quite possible that it did have the rattle. I think this one is actually my favourite. The cypress tree. As the cypress tree, which is called a sav in Persian, is actually a very common motif both in the arts of Iran as well as literature, classical literature of Iran. Often the cypress is used in classical Persian poetry as a metaphor for the beloved. It's often compared with the body of the beloved. So the shape and the stature of the cypress is often referred to when talking about the stature of the beloved. The cypress tree, now that I pick it up, we can hear that it also has a rattle, which is again quite different to the other two. I think it sounds like there are more pieces in the cypress, and it's also, the pitch is a bit lower than the duck was. I think all the pieces inside feel like they're different shapes and sizes and weights as well. And we can also see that the base, again, does have a pattern scored into it, probably while the clay was still slightly wet before firing. And here we've got a zigzag pattern, which is quite different from the cross-hatching of the oval rasp and the duck rasp. It still feels like it might be effective on your feet. To me, this rattle sounds like the rattles made of quite big objects. I think they also sound like they're round. The duck also has a rattle, but it sounds quite different to the oval. I think while the rattle inside the oval was sort of bigger objects that were possibly round, the rattle inside this bird feels a bit smaller with its high pitch. The cypress tree, now that I pick it up, we can hear that it also has a rattle, which is again quite different to the other two. I think it sounds like there are more pieces in the cypress, and it's also, the pitch is a bit lower than the duck was. I think all the pieces inside feel like they're different shapes and sizes and weights as well. Now, these objects are, I would say, sort of high-end objects. They're elite objects. We'd say that because most ceramics are unglazed. So we can see from the base of the objects, for practical purposes. They're unglazed, but the rest of the objects are glazed and they're highly decorated. So that makes me think that they were not your average, your everyday bath rasp. It's likely that there would have been unglazed bath rasps as well, but all of these are glazed, which suggests that they would have been used by members of the higher echelons of society. In some ways, these objects are also remarkable in the collection in that they're self-care objects that would have been used by people in very personal and possibly private ways to look after themselves.